Tonight, we're going to talk about something that sounds simple, but cuts right to the heart of what it means to be human. Why haven't we changed? Look at yourself in the mirror. Now imagine your ancestor from 50,000 years ago doing the same thing. If mirrors had existed then, you'd look remarkably similar. Same basic height, same skull shape, same number of fingers and toes. The skin tone might differ, sure, and maybe the build would be leaner or stockier depending on climate. But the fundamental blueprint, the architecture of what makes a human body human, would be nearly identical. It's strange when you think about it. 50,000 years is a geological eye blink, yes, but it's also 2,000 generations, 2,000 opportunities for change, for adaptation, for evolution to work its slow magic on our species. And yet, if you place that ancient human in modern clothing and sat them on a subway, most people wouldn't give them a second glance. They might look a bit different, a bit rougher around the edges perhaps, but recognizably, undeniably human. If you enjoy learning about the history of humanity while you sleep, it would be of great help to me if you would like the video and subscribe. Also, comment down below what topic you would like explored next. Now back to the video. This apparent stillness has led many people, including some scientists, to suggest that human evolution has stopped, that we've reached some kind of endpoint, a finished product. The argument goes something like this: we've conquered nature through technology, medicine, and culture. We no longer face the brutal selection pressures that shaped our ancestors. Nearly everyone survives to adulthood now, at least in developed nations. Natural selection, that merciless editor of genetic variation, has been switched off. We've stepped out of the evolutionary current and onto the shore, watching from safety as other species continue their slow transformations. The paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould expressed a version of this view in a 2000 interview, stating there's been no biological change in humans in 40,000 or 50,000 years. Everything we call culture and civilization, he argued, we've built with the same body and brain. It's a compelling narrative. It fits with our sense of human exceptionalism, our feeling that we've somehow transcended the biological rules that govern the rest of life on Earth. When you can replace a failing heart, cure infections that would have killed your grandmother, or engineer crops that feed billions, it's easy to believe you've escaped the constraints of evolution. But here's the thing. It's wrong. Spectacularly, demonstrably wrong. Human evolution hasn't stopped. If anything, in some ways, it's accelerated. We're evolving right now as you listen to this, as you breathe, as your DNA quietly accumulates tiny changes that will ripple forward through time. The changes are subtle, yes, and they happen on timescales that make them nearly invisible to individual human perception. But they're real, they're measurable, and they're reshaping our species in ways both obvious and hidden. The question isn't whether humans are still evolving. The question is why we ever thought we'd stopped in the first place, and what our evolution looks like in an age of antibiotics, agriculture, and air conditioning. Because the story of human evolution in the modern age is stranger and more fascinating than the simple narrative of biological stasis would suggest. What we mean when we say evolution. Before we go any further, we need to get something straight. When most people hear the word evolution, they picture dramatic transformations. Fish crawling onto land and sprouting legs, apes standing upright and losing their fur. dinosaurs sprouting feathers and taking to the sky. These big, sweeping changes, macroevolution as scientists call it, are the stuff of museum displays and documentary narration. They're evolution's greatest hits, the blockbuster transformations that happen over millions of years and fundamentally reshape what a creature is. But that's not the only kind of evolution, and it's not even the kind we're primarily talking about when we discuss modern humans. The evolution happening to us right now, the evolution that's been happening throughout recorded history, is something quieter. It's microevolution, changes in gene frequencies within populations over relatively short timescales. It's the shift in how common a particular genetic variant is, the slow creep of one version of a gene becoming more prevalent, while another fades into rarity. Think of it this way. Imagine a population where 10% of people can digest milk as adults. Fast forward a few thousand years, and suddenly 70% can. The people haven't sprouted new organs. They haven't developed entirely new biochemical pathways. But a genetic switch that used to turn off after childhood, shutting down the production of lactase, the enzyme that breaks down milk sugar, now stays on. That's evolution. It's a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. And here's what's crucial to understand. Evolution requires only three things. Variation, meaning individuals in a population differ from one another in ways that are heritable. Heredity, meaning those differences can be passed from parents to offspring. And differential survival or reproduction, meaning some variants are more successful at surviving and reproducing than others, even if only slightly more successful. That's it. That's the recipe. You don't need millions of years. You don't need dramatic environmental catastrophes. You just need those three ingredients, and evolution will happen. It's not optional. It's not something that can be turned off. As long as there are genetic differences between individuals, as long as those differences affect how many children they have or how long they live, evolution is occurring. Now, natural selection is the most famous mechanism of evolution, the one Darwin made famous. It's the process by which traits that help organisms survive and reproduce become more common over time, while traits that harm survival and reproduction become rarer. If you can run faster than your neighbors in a world full of predators, you're more likely to live long enough to have children, and your speedy genes become more common in the next generation. That's natural selection in action. But natural selection isn't the only way evolution happens. There's also genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies that occur simply by chance, especially in small populations. If a small group of people gets isolated on an island, the gene frequencies in that population might shift dramatically over generations, not because certain genes are better or worse, but just through random sampling effects. Genetic drift doesn't care about fitness. It's pure chance, the evolutionary equivalent of rolling dice. Then there's gene flow, the movement of genes between populations through migration and interbreeding. When people from different populations have children together, they're mixing their gene pools, introducing genetic variants that might be common in one population into another, where they're rare. This has been a constant feature of human history, with waves of migration and conquest and trade continually shuffling genetic diversity around the globe. And there's mutation, the ultimate source of all genetic variation. The random copying errors and environmental damage that introduce new genetic variants into the population. Every one of us carries between 50 and 100 new mutations that neither of our parents had. Most of them do nothing. Neutral changes in stretches of DNA that don't code for anything important. A few are harmful, and very occasionally, one might be beneficial in the right environment. All of these processes, selection, drift, gene flow, and mutation, are constantly operating on human populations. They don't require our permission. They don't pause because we've invented hospitals or smartphones. They're fundamental features of how populations of reproducing organisms work, as inevitable as gravity. So when we ask whether humans are still evolving, we're really asking whether these processes are still operating. Are there still genetic differences between people? Obviously, yes. We're one of the most genetically diverse species on the planet. Do those differences still get passed to children? Obviously, yes, unless you think heredity has somehow been repealed. Do those differences still affect survival and reproduction? This is where it gets interesting, because the answer is more subtle than you might think. The paradox of modern humans. Here's the paradox that trips people up. Modern humans, anatomically modern humans to be precise, emerged somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago in Africa. The exact details are still being debated, and new fossil discoveries keep pushing back the timeline, but the basic picture is clear. By around 200,000 years ago, there were people walking around who, if you clean them up and put them in modern clothes, would look perfectly at home in any city on Earth today. Their skeletons match ours, the shape of their skulls, the proportions of their limbs, the structure of their hands and feet, all fall within the range of variation you'd see in modern humans. They had the same brain size we do, roughly 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters on average. They buried their dead with ceremony, created art, made sophisticated tools, and probably had language, though we can't know for certain since soft tissue doesn't fossilize. And then, for the next 150,000 years or so, not a whole lot seemed to change, at least in terms of their physical appearance. The skeletons from 100,000 years ago look like the skeletons from 50,000 years ago, which look like the skeletons from 10,000 years ago, which look like yours. Same basic body plan, same basic proportions, same basic brain size. This apparent stasis led to the idea, which took hold powerfully in the late 20th century, that human evolution had effectively ended once we reached our modern form. The paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould famously declared that there's been no biological change in humans in 40,000 or 50,000 years. Everything we call culture and civilization, he argued, we've built with the same body and brain. It's an appealing idea. It suggests a kind of completion, as if evolution worked on our species for millions of years, gradually refining us, and then, around 200,000 years ago, it finished the job. Look, it said, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, all done. And since then, we've been coasting on that finished product, using culture and technology to adapt to new environments instead of evolving new biological features. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, several problems. First, the idea that nothing has changed physically is based primarily on looking at skeletons, and skeletons only tell you so much. They'll tell you about overall body size, proportions, brain volume, and bone structure. but they won't tell you anything about changes in skin color, hair texture, eye color, metabolic efficiency, immune function, or any of the countless physiological and biochemical systems that don't leave marks on bone. Second, and this is crucial, evolution doesn't have to produce dramatic visible changes to be happening. Most evolutionary change at the molecular level, at the level of DNA sequences, is invisible. You can't see it by looking at someone. Changes in immune system genes, in metabolic enzymes, in the regulation of development, all of these can evolve without changing the basic architecture of the human body. Third, even when we do look at visible physical traits, we find changes. Humans have become shorter on average over the last 10,000 years since the adoption of agriculture. European males 40,000 years ago, the Cro-Magnon people, averaged around 6 feet tall. By 10,000 years ago, that had dropped to around 5'4". Some of this is probably environmental, the result of poor nutrition and disease, but genetic changes played a role too. Our teeth and jaws have also gotten smaller over the last 30,000 years. Early modern humans had bigger, more robust jaws and larger teeth than we do now. This makes sense when you think about diet. As we started cooking food, processing it, making it softer, we no longer needed the massive crushing power of our ancestors. Over time, people with slightly smaller jaws weren't at a disadvantage, and the average size decreased. But the most dramatic evidence for recent human evolution comes not from looking at bones, but from looking at DNA. With the genomic revolution over the past 2 decades, scientists can now sequence complete genomes from thousands of individuals, compare them, and look for signatures of recent selection, regions of the genome where one variant has been spreading rapidly through a population, indicating that it's being favored by natural selection. And when they do this, they find evidence of selection everywhere. Hundreds of genes show signs of having been under strong selective pressure within the last 10,000 years. Many of them are related to diet and disease resistance, which makes perfect sense. The adoption of agriculture 10,000 years ago fundamentally changed human life, introducing new diseases, new diets, new population densities, and new selective pressures. So we're faced with a paradox. On the one hand, the basic human body plan has been remarkably stable for the last 200,000 years. On the other hand, when we look deeper at the molecular level, we see abundant evidence of ongoing evolution, including recent rapid evolution. How do we reconcile these observations? The answer is that evolution operates on multiple levels and at multiple speeds. The basic architecture of the human body, the things you can see in a skeleton, are governed by developmental programs that are deeply conserved and highly constrained. You can't just add an extra arm or double the brain size without breaking all sorts of other systems. These large-scale changes require coordinated changes across many genes, and they happen slowly over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. But smaller changes, tweaks to existing systems, can happen much faster. A change in skin pigmentation, for instance, can be accomplished by altering the activity of just a handful of genes that regulate melanin production. An adult's ability to digest milk can be switched on by a single mutation in a regulatory region near the lactase gene. Resistance to malaria can be conferred by a single amino acid change in hemoglobin. These kinds of changes, alterations to existing traits, rather than the invention of entirely new ones, can happen quickly, over just a few thousand years, or even less, and they're happening all the time. We just don't notice them because they don't change the fundamental shape of a human being. The fossil record's deceptive silence. There's another reason why people think human evolution has stopped, and it has to do with how we perceive time. 50,000 years feels like forever to us. It's more than twice as long as recorded human history. It's longer than all of civilization, all of agriculture, all of art and writing and cities and empires. When we look back 50,000 years, we're looking into a time so distant it might as well be another world. But in evolutionary terms, 50,000 years is nothing. It's a blink. It's barely enough time for any noticeable, large-scale physical changes to accumulate, especially in a species like ours with long generation times. To understand this, you have to think in terms of generations, not years. Evolution happens when genes are passed from parents to offspring, so the relevant timescale is how many reproductive cycles have occurred, not how many years have passed. A species that reproduces every few months, like mice or fruit flies, can go through hundreds or even thousands of generations in the time it takes humans to go through just one. Human generation time, the average age at which people have children, has varied throughout history, but it's typically been somewhere between 20 and 30 years. Let's say 25 years as a rough average. That means 50,000 years represents only about 2,000 human generations. 2,000 sounds like a lot until you realize that bacteria can go through 2,000 generations in a few months and fruit flies in a few years. This matters because the rate of evolutionary change, all else being equal, scales with the number of generations, not the number of years. A new beneficial mutation that arises in a population will spread through that population over a certain number of generations. If your generation time is long, that same process will take much longer in years, and human generation times are long, among the longest of any mammal. We're a slow reproducing species. We take years to reach sexual maturity. We have long pregnancies. We typically have one offspring at a time, and we invest heavily in raising each child. All of this means that our evolutionary clock ticks slowly compared to most other species. To put this in perspective, consider lactose tolerance, which is one of the textbook examples of recent human evolution. The genetic mutation that allows some adults to digest milk arose somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, based on genetic dating studies and archaeological evidence, probably in multiple places independently. In that time, it's gone from being essentially non-existent to being present in more than 90% of some Northern European populations and around 35% of the global population. That sounds fast, and in human terms it is fast. 10,000 years. But in generational terms, it's only about 400 generations. For a mutation to go from rare to common in 400 generations requires pretty strong selection pressure. It has to confer a real advantage. And indeed, being able to drink milk and access its calories and nutrients, especially in northern climates where other food sources might be scarce and where you're not getting enough vitamin D from sunlight, was apparently a significant advantage. But 400 generations is still 400 opportunities for the mutation to spread. 400 cycles of people with a mutation having slightly more children or living slightly longer than people without it. Evolution works, but it works slowly, especially in us. Now, here's where the fossil record becomes deceptive. Fossils are snapshots, frozen moments in time. And because fossilization is rare, those snapshots are widely spaced. We might have a skull from 100,000 years ago and another from 90,000 years ago. But those 10,000 years in between, that's 400 generations, plenty of time for significant genetic changes to occur at the molecular level, but not necessarily enough time for those changes to show up in the gross anatomy that fossils preserve. Moreover, dating fossils is hard. We're often working with date ranges that span thousands of years. A fossil might be dated to somewhere between 190,000 and 110,000 years old. That's a 20,000-year window, 800 generations. If evolution was producing gradual changes in skull shape or body size during that period, we'd have a hard time detecting it because our temporal resolution isn't fine enough. This creates an illusion of stasis. When we look at the fossil record, we see what appears to be long periods of no change punctuated by occasional bursts of rapid change, a pattern that fits with Gould's own theory of punctuated equilibria. But some of that apparent stasis might just be an artifact of the limits of our data. We're looking at a low-resolution recording and concluding that nothing happened during the quiet parts, when in reality, there might have been all sorts of changes happening. We just can't see them. And then there's the question of what counts as change. If every generation, the average height in a population shifts by a tiny amount, so small you'd never notice it in a single individual, but consistently in one direction. Over a few hundred generations, you could end up with a noticeable difference in average height. But you'd only see that if you had good data from every generation, which of course we don't. The fossil record is also biased toward preserving certain kinds of information. Hard tissues, bones and teeth fossilize. Soft tissues generally don't, except under very unusual conditions. So we know a lot about how human skeletons have changed over time, but we know almost nothing about how soft tissue anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry have evolved, at least not from fossils alone. Skin color, for instance, is entirely a soft tissue trait. There's no way to know what color someone's skin was from their skeleton. And yet skin color is one of the most obvious ways humans from different populations differ, and it's evolved rapidly, probably within the last 100,000 years, as humans migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia, encountering different levels of ultraviolet radiation. Skin color changed. Darker skin near the equator protects against too much UV. Lighter skin at higher latitudes allows more UV penetration to synthesize vitamin D. These changes happened relatively recently in evolutionary time, but you'd never know it from looking at skeletons. The only reason we know about it is from studying the genetics of pigmentation and seeing clear signatures of recent strong selection on the genes that control skin color. So when people say that humans haven't changed in 50,000 years, what they really mean is that our skeletons haven't changed much in 50,000 years. But skeletons are only one part of what makes us human, and not necessarily the part where most recent evolution has been happening. The real story of recent human evolution is written not in fossils but in genomes. And when we read those genomes, we find a story of constant, ongoing change. A story of adaptation to new environments, new diets, new diseases. A story that's still being written right now, with every new generation, including yours. The notion that human evolution ground to a halt is intuitive but wrong, and we now have mountains of evidence proving it. The genomic revolution, the ability to quickly and cheaply sequence DNA, has given us an unprecedented window into recent human evolution. We can now compare the genomes of thousands of people from different populations around the world, look for patterns, and identify regions of the genome that show telltale signs of recent selection. And what we've found is striking. Far from having stopped, human evolution appears to have accelerated in the last 10,000 years, particularly after the adoption of agriculture. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found evidence suggesting that the rate of adaptive evolution in humans has accelerated dramatically. The study analyzed genetic data and concluded that the recent rate appears to be 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher, potentially 10 to 100 times faster than the long-term average over the 6 million years since we split from chimpanzees. How is this possible? Isn't modern medicine supposed to have relaxed selection pressures? Well, yes and no. It's true that in wealthy countries with access to modern healthcare, the selective pressure against many genetic diseases has been reduced. A child born with a genetic condition that would have been fatal 100 years ago might now live a normal lifespan and have children of their own. In that sense, selection against harmful mutations has weakened. But selection doesn't only work by killing people. It also works through differential reproduction. If people with a certain genetic variant tend to have slightly more children than people without it, that variant will increase in frequency, even if nobody is dying. And reproductive patterns have changed dramatically in modern times in ways that create new selective pressures. Moreover, the last 10,000 years haven't been a time of easy living for most humans. They've been a time of radical environmental change. As humans adopted agriculture, domesticated animals, built cities, and created population densities that had never existed before. Each of these changes created new selective pressures. Agriculture, for instance, fundamentally changed the human diet. Instead of eating a diverse mix of wild plants and animals, most people suddenly started eating a lot of grain, wheat, rice, corn, depending on where they lived. This created selective pressure for genetic variants that help digest and metabolize these foods efficiently. One of the clearest examples is the AMY1 gene, which codes for amylase, an enzyme that breaks down starch. Hunter-gatherers generally have relatively few copies of this gene, but people whose ancestors adopted agriculture and started eating lots of starchy grains tend to have many more copies. Some populations have as many as 10 or 15 copies of AMY1, compared to just 2 or 3 in groups that never adopted grain agriculture. Having more copies of the amylase gene means you produce more of the enzyme, which means you can digest starch more efficiently, extract more calories from grains, and presumably survive better on an agricultural diet. This is a clear case of recent evolution in response to a new dietary challenge. Another famous example is lactose tolerance. Most mammals, including most humans for most of human history, lose the ability to digest milk sugar after they're weaned. The gene that produces lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, gets switched off in childhood. If you try to drink milk as an adult without lactase, the lactose passes into your colon where bacteria ferment it, causing gas, bloating, and diarrhea. But in some populations, particularly in Northern Europe, East Africa, and parts of the Middle East, a genetic mutation arose that keeps the lactase gene switched on into adulthood. This mutation has spread rapidly through these populations, reaching frequencies of 70% or more in some places. Why? Because in these regions, people domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats and started drinking milk. Being able to digest milk provided access to a rich source of calories, protein, calcium, and vitamin D, especially important in northern climates with long winters and little sunlight. The mutation for lactose tolerance is relatively recent, arising somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that's yesterday, but it's already reached high frequencies in many populations, a testament to how strong the selective advantage must have been. This isn't speculation, by the way. Geneticists can actually calculate how strong selection has to be to produce this kind of rapid change, and it's substantial. Then there's disease resistance. Living in large, dense populations created perfect conditions for infectious diseases to spread. Epidemics of smallpox, plague, measles, typhoid, and countless others swept through human populations repeatedly over the last several thousand years. This created intense selective pressure for genetic variants that conferred resistance to these diseases. One of the most studied examples is the sickle cell allele, a mutation in the hemoglobin gene. If you inherit 2 copies of this allele, one from each parent, you develop sickle cell anemia, a serious disease where your red blood cells deform into a sickle shape and can't carry oxygen properly. It's often fatal without treatment. But if you inherit just 1 copy of the sickle cell allele, you don't get sickle cell anemia. Instead, you get significant protection against malaria, one of the biggest killers in human history, and still a major cause of death in tropical regions. The malaria parasite has a hard time reproducing in red blood cells that carry 1 sickle cell allele. This creates a situation called heterozygote advantage. Having 1 copy of the allele is beneficial because it protects against malaria. Having 2 copies is harmful because it causes sickle cell disease. Having 0 copies leaves you vulnerable to malaria. In regions where malaria is common, the benefit of malaria resistance outweighs the cost of the disease, so the sickle cell allele is maintained at relatively high frequencies. This is recent evolution driven by recent selection pressure. Malaria became a major threat to humans only after we adopted agriculture and created standing water in rice paddies and irrigation ditches, providing breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Before agriculture, malaria was much less common, and the sickle cell allele was probably very rare or absent. Now it's found at frequencies of 10 to 40% in some African and Mediterranean populations. And it's not just 1 mutation. There are actually several different mutations that provide malaria resistance, and they've arisen independently in different populations. There's hemoglobin C, hemoglobin E, and mutations affecting glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, among others. Each provides some protection against malaria. Each has become common in malaria-prone regions, and each represents a case of recent, rapid evolution in response to disease. We also see evolution in response to urbanization. One study found that people in cities that have been settled for thousands of years, like Susa in Iran, universally carry a particular allele that provides resistance to tuberculosis and leprosy. diseases that thrive in dense urban populations. But in cities that have only been urban for a few centuries, like Yakutsk in Siberia, only 70 to 80% of the population carry this allele. This suggests that the allele has been under selection in old urban centers for long enough to reach near fixation. But in younger cities, it's still spreading. High-altitude adaptation is another striking example. People who live in the Andes and the Tibetan Plateau, both above 10,000 feet, have evolved genetic adaptations that help them cope with low oxygen levels. The specific mutations are different in the two populations. They evolved independently, but both affect how the body responds to hypoxia. Tibetans, for instance, have mutations in genes like EPAS1 and EGLN1 that prevent their bodies from overproducing red blood cells in response to low oxygen, which might sound counterintuitive. Wouldn't more red blood cells help carry more oxygen? Actually, no. Too many red blood cells make your blood thick and sluggish, increasing the risk of stroke and other complications. The Tibetan adaptations allow them to maintain normal red blood cell counts while still extracting enough oxygen from the thin air, a more elegant solution. These adaptations arose recently, probably within the last 10,000 years, as people moved into these high-altitude environments. They represent clear cases of natural selection acting on human populations in response to environmental challenges. To truly understand why human evolution looks the way it does, why changes seem slow and subtle rather than dramatic, we need to talk about generation time. And here, humans face a fundamental handicap compared to most other species on Earth. Generation time is exactly what it sounds like. The average time between when an organism is born and when it reproduces. For bacteria, this might be 20 minutes. For fruit flies, it's a couple of weeks. For mice, a few months. For elephants, around 20 years. And for humans, it's even longer, somewhere between 25 and 30 years, depending on the population and time period. Why does this matter? Because evolution, at its core, is a generational process. Mutations arise, are passed to offspring, spread through a population or disappear, and over many generations, these changes accumulate. The currency of evolution isn't years, it's generations. Everything that happens in evolution, from the spread of a beneficial mutation to the diversification of species, is counted in generations. This means that for the same amount of calendar time, a species with a short generation time can evolve much faster than a species with a long generation time, all else being equal. A species of mouse can go through 50 generations, while humans go through just one. That's 50 opportunities for new mutations to arise, 50 chances for selection to act, 50 rounds of the evolutionary process, and it shows in the data. When scientists compare rates of genetic change across different species, controlling for generation time, they find that per generation, evolution proceeds at roughly similar rates. But per year, species with shorter generation times evolve faster. This is called the generation time effect, and it's one of the fundamental constraints on how fast evolution can occur in long-lived species like us. Humans have actually been experiencing a slowdown in our molecular evolutionary rate compared to our primate ancestors, particularly since we split from chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. Part of this is due to our increasingly long generation times. Our ancestors probably reproduced younger, had shorter lifespans and thus shorter generation times. Modern humans in developed countries often wait until their 30s to have children, pushing generation time even longer. There's another wrinkle here. In humans, as in many mammals, the father's age matters more than the mother's for mutation rate. This is because sperm are produced continuously throughout a man's life through many cell divisions, and each division is an opportunity for copying errors. The older the father, the more cell divisions have occurred, and the more mutations his sperm carry. Eggs, by contrast, are mostly formed before a woman is born. They sit arrested in development, waiting, accumulating relatively few mutations. A study found that each year a father delays reproduction adds about 2 new mutations to his offspring's genome. Over a lifetime, this really adds up. A 20-year-old father contributes about 25 new mutations to his child. A 40-year-old father contributes about 75. This means that as human generation times have increased, particularly paternal age at reproduction, we've been accumulating mutations somewhat faster per generation, but still slower per year than our ancestors did. It's a complex picture, but the bottom line is that our long generation time is a significant constraint on how quickly visible evolutionary changes can accumulate. To put this in stark perspective, consider the difference between human evolution and that of a virus, like influenza. The flu virus can go through hundreds of generations in a single human flu season. That's why it evolves so fast, why we need a new flu vaccine every year. The virus is constantly churning out new variants, and natural selection ruthlessly weeds out the ones that our immune systems can recognize, while favoring the ones that can slip past our defenses. Humans will never evolve that fast. We can't. Our generation time simply doesn't allow it. Even if we faced intense selective pressure, even if only people with a certain genetic variant survived to reproduce, it would still take many generations, hundreds of years at minimum, for that variant to spread through the population. This is actually important to keep in mind when thinking about human evolution. When we see a genetic variant increase from rare to common in a few thousand years, that's not slow evolution. That's actually very fast evolution for a species with our generation time. It indicates strong, sustained selection pressure over many generations. But it also means that the kind of large-scale physical changes we see in the fossil record over millions of years, things like brain size increases or changes in body proportions, necessarily happen slowly for us. Each change requires many generations to spread, and coordinated changes across multiple genes require even longer. This is why we still look basically like our ancestors from 50,000 years ago. It's not that evolution stopped, it's that 50,000 years in human generational time just isn't that long. Now, you might ask, does our long generation time at least come with any benefits? Actually, yes. Long generation times are typically associated with longer lifespans, larger body sizes, and more parental investment in offspring. We take longer to reproduce, but we also live longer, grow larger brains, and invest heavily in raising our children. This K-selection strategy, as it's called, has been very successful for us as a species, allowing us to dominate a wide range of environments, but it comes at the cost of evolutionary speed. We're the tortoise, not the hare. We can't rapidly evolve our way out of new challenges the way bacteria or viruses can. Instead, we've evolved something else, behavioral, and cultural flexibility. We can change our behavior, our technology, our social organization much faster than we can change our genes. And for much of our recent history, that's been our primary mode of adaptation. Which brings us to an interesting point. Some people argue that cultural evolution has replaced biological evolution in humans. We no longer need to evolve resistance to cold, the argument goes, because we can make warm clothing and build heated shelters. We don't need to evolve to digest new foods because we can cook and process them. We don't need to evolve better vision because we can make glasses. There's some truth to this. Cultural adaptations can indeed happen much faster than genetic ones. A new technology can spread through a population in years or decades, not centuries or millennia. And in many cases, cultural solutions are more flexible and powerful than biological ones. You can't evolve perfect vision that works underwater, in the dark, and at telescopic distances, but you can invent goggles, night vision, and binoculars. But cultural evolution hasn't stopped biological evolution. What it's done is change the selective pressures, not eliminate them. Our cultural innovations create new environments, and those new environments create new selection pressures. Agriculture selected for genetic variants that helped digest grains. Dairy farming selected for lactose tolerance. Urbanization selected for disease resistance. Technology shapes our evolution, just not always in the ways we expect. Cultural evolution versus biological evolution. The relationship between cultural evolution and biological evolution in humans is one of the most fascinating and complex topics in all of science. To understand modern human evolution, we have to understand this relationship, because in our species, unlike almost any other, these two forms of evolution are deeply intertwined. Let's start with what we mean by cultural evolution. Culture, broadly defined, is information that's passed from person to person through learning, rather than through genes. Language, technology, beliefs, customs, knowledge, all of these are cultural, and they evolve. New ideas arise, spread through populations, combine with other ideas, get modified, and sometimes go extinct. The process has similarities to biological evolution, variation, transmission, and selection, but the mechanisms are different. In biological evolution, information is stored in DNA, transmitted vertically from parents to offspring during reproduction, and selection acts on genetic variants based on their effects on survival and reproduction. The process is slow, constrained by generation time, and mostly blind to the future. Evolution can't look ahead and evolve features because they'll be useful someday. It can only work with whatever variation exists now. Cultural evolution is different in almost every way. Information is stored in brains and in external media like books or computers. Transmission can be horizontal, from peer to peer, or oblique, from non-parent adults to children, or even backwards, from children to parents. Think of kids teaching their parents how to use smartphones. Selection can be conscious and goal-directed. People can deliberately choose which ideas to adopt and which to reject. And cultural evolution can be blazingly fast. A new technology or idea can spread worldwide in months. This speed gives cultural evolution an enormous advantage as a mode of adaptation. When humans first moved into the Arctic, they didn't have to wait for biological evolution to give them thicker fur and more efficient fat metabolism. They could immediately start wearing warmer clothes and building better shelters. When agriculture was invented, People didn't have to wait for their guts to evolve to handle grains. They could just start cooking and processing the grains in ways that made them easier to digest. Because of this, it's tempting to think that cultural evolution has made biological evolution obsolete for humans. And in a sense, for some kinds of adaptation it has. We're never going to evolve biological antifreeze like some Arctic fish, because we don't need to. We have parkas. But here's the key insight that people often miss. Cultural evolution doesn't eliminate biological evolution. It redirects it. It creates new selective pressures. Our cultural innovations build new environments, and those new environments select for genetic variants that help us thrive in them. Think about dairy farming. The decision to domesticate cattle and drink their milk was a cultural innovation. It spread through social learning, not through genes. But once it became a common practice, it created a new selective pressure. People who happened to have a mutation that let them digest milk as adults could access a new food source and gain a nutritional advantage. Over time, that genetic variant spread, especially in populations that relied heavily on dairy. This is gene culture coevolution. The cultural practice of dairy farming created the selective environment that favored the genetic mutation for lactose tolerance. And the spread of that genetic mutation made dairy farming more valuable and viable for those populations, reinforcing the cultural practice. Genes and culture evolve together, each influencing the other. We see this pattern over and over. The cultural practice of agriculture selected for genes related to starch digestion and immune function. The cultural practice of urbanization selected for disease resistance. The cultural practice of cooking selected for smaller teeth and jaws. Our culture shapes our genes, and our genes shape which cultural practices are successful. This creates a feedback loop that can accelerate evolution. Cultural innovations can spread quickly through a population, creating new selective pressures that then drive genetic changes. Those genetic changes can then enable new cultural innovations, which create new selective pressures, and on it goes. Some researchers argue that this gene-culture coevolution has actually sped up human evolution in recent millennia, not slowed it down. Consider language. The capacity for language is clearly biological. It depends on specific brain structures, particular patterns of neural organization, and fine control of the vocal apparatus. These are all genetically influenced traits that evolved over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. But the specific languages we speak, English or Mandarin or Swahili, are purely cultural. They're learned, not inherited. Now here's where it gets interesting. Once some form of language arose in our ancestors, it created a new selective pressure for genes that enhanced language ability. Individuals who were better at language, who could learn it faster, use it more effectively, communicate more clearly, would have had advantages in coordinating group activities, passing on knowledge, forming alliances, and so on. This selected for genetic changes that improved language capacity. But those genetic improvements made more complex language possible, which increased the value of language, which increased the selective pressure for language-related genes, which enabled even more complex language. Genes and culture co-evolved, ratcheting each other up, until we ended up with our extraordinary linguistic abilities. This same pattern applies to many uniquely human traits. Our large brains, our extended childhood, our unusual degree of cooperation with non-relatives, our ability to accumulate knowledge across generations, all of these are products of gene-culture coevolution. Culture created the selective environment that favored bigger brains, and bigger brains enabled more complex culture. Now, in the modern world, the balance between cultural and biological evolution has arguably shifted even more toward culture. We can now adapt to new environments almost entirely through cultural means. Moving to a different climate, just bring the right clothes and technology. New disease threat, develop a vaccine, food shortage, improve agricultural techniques, or import food from elsewhere. This has led some to argue that we've escaped biological evolution entirely, that we're now evolving culturally, but not genetically. But even this isn't quite true. For one thing, cultural adaptations aren't perfect substitutes for biological ones. Glasses correct vision, but they're not as good as naturally perfect eyesight. They can break, get lost, or be unavailable. And while modern medicine can treat many genetic diseases, it can't cure them, meaning people with those conditions still face challenges that people without them don't. More importantly, even in the modern world, there are still genetic differences in reproductive success. People with different genetic backgrounds have different numbers of children on average, for all sorts of complex reasons involving health, fertility, behavior, and circumstances. As long as there's any heritable variation in reproductive success, evolution is happening, even if the specific traits being selected for are different from what they were in the past. And some of these modern selective pressures are quite different from what our ancestors faced. For instance, there's evidence that in modern populations, selection is acting on traits like age at first reproduction and number of children. Women who start having children earlier and have more of them pass on more of their genes, obviously, which means that genetic variants that influence these traits are under selection. Interestingly, some studies suggest that selection in modern populations favors earlier reproduction and more children, which might seem counterintuitive given that in developed countries, people generally have fewer children and have them later. But remember, evolution acts on variation within a population. If within that population, people who have children earlier and have more of them are passing on more genes, those traits will become more common over time, even if the average number of children is declining for other reasons. This highlights something crucial. Evolution doesn't care about what's good for society or for the species. It only cares about what gets genes into the next generation. A trait that increases individual reproductive success will spread, even if it's not necessarily optimal at the societal level. But the point is, both cultural and biological evolution are ongoing in humans. They're not mutually exclusive. They're interlocking processes that influence each other in complex ways. Our genes affect our capacity for culture, and our culture creates selective pressures that shape our genes. Understanding modern human evolution requires understanding both processes and how they interact. Modern selection pressures. Now, let's talk about what kinds of selection pressures humans actually face in the modern world. This is where things get really interesting, because the answer is not what you might expect. The common assumption is that modern medicine and technology have eliminated most selection pressures. Nobody dies from infections anymore, or from starvation, or from getting eaten by predators. We've buffered ourselves against the harsh realities of nature. Survival of the fittest no longer applies, but this assumption is wrong on multiple levels. First, it's only true for a small fraction of humanity. The majority of people on Earth still don't have access to advanced medical care. They still face risks from infectious disease, malnutrition, and other environmental hazards. For them, traditional selective pressures remain very much in effect. Malaria, for instance, still kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, mostly children in sub-Saharan Africa. This ongoing selection pressure is why genetic variants that provide malaria resistance, like the sickle cell allele, are still being maintained at high frequencies in affected populations. If everyone had access to effective malaria prevention and treatment, the selective advantage of these variants would disappear, and they'd likely decline in frequency over time. But we're not there yet. Infectious disease more broadly continues to be a major selective force in many parts of the world. Tuberculosis, HIV, cholera, dengue fever, and many other diseases still exact a heavy toll. And remember, selection doesn't require everyone to die. It just requires differences in survival or reproductive success. Even if a disease only reduces fertility or makes people slightly less likely to reproduce, it's exerting selective pressure. Second, even in wealthy countries with excellent medical care, selection is still happening, just not necessarily in the form of differential survival. It's happening through differential reproduction. Some people have more children than others, and if any of that variation is due to genetic factors, evolution is occurring. Now, reproductive patterns in modern societies are complex and influenced by all sorts of factors: education, career, economics, culture, and individual choice. But there's growing evidence that genetics plays a role too, not in determining how many children someone wants, but in influencing various traits that correlate with fertility. For instance, there's evidence of selection on age at first birth in modern populations. Women who have children earlier, on average, pass on more of their genes. This creates selection pressure for genetic variants that influence when women start reproducing. Interestingly, studies suggest that this pressure is actually quite strong in modern populations, potentially stronger than some of the selective pressures our ancestors faced. Similarly, there's selection on menopause timing. Research indicates that menopause is evolving to occur later, allowing a longer reproductive window. This makes sense. If having children over a longer period allows you to have more children or to have healthier children, genetic variants that delay menopause would be favored. There's also evidence of selection related to health and longevity, but in subtle ways. A study looking at large data sets from places like the Framingham Heart Study and UK Biobank found that certain genetic variants associated with cardiovascular disease and other health conditions are becoming less common. For instance, the APOE4 variant, which increases Alzheimer's risk and cardiovascular disease, appears to be declining in frequency. This isn't necessarily because people with these variants are dying before reproducing, though that might play some role. It's more likely that people with genetic variants that predispose them to health problems have slightly fewer children on average, perhaps because of reduced fertility or energy, or perhaps because they're less likely to find partners. The effect is small, but it's there, and over many generations, even small effects add up. Interestingly, modern medicine might actually create some new selective pressures, not eliminate them. For instance, caesarean sections have made it possible for babies to be born even when they're too large to fit through the birth canal. In the past, such situations would often result in the death of mother, child, or both. Natural selection strongly favored baby sizes and pelvic dimensions that allowed for safe natural birth. But now, with C-sections widely available, at least in some places, that selective pressure has been relaxed. This means that genetic variants for larger babies or narrower pelvises, which would have been selected against in the past, can now be passed on. Over time, this could lead to an increase in the proportion of births that require C-sections, which is indeed what we're seeing in some populations. This is an example of relaxed selection, where a trait that was previously under strong selection is no longer selected, and genetic variation increases. It's still evolution, just in a different direction. But perhaps the most significant modern selective pressures have to do with disease resistance, particularly resistance to new or re-emerging infectious diseases. HIV, for instance, emerged only in the 20th century, but it's already driven noticeable evolution in human populations. Some people have genetic variants that make them resistant to HIV infection or slow the progression of AIDS. The most famous is the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, which prevents the virus from entering immune cells. People with 2 copies of this variant are almost completely immune to most strains of HIV. People with 1 copy progress more slowly to AIDS if infected. This variant is relatively rare, found in about 10% of Europeans, but almost absent in African and Asian populations. Its distribution suggests it might have been selected for by some past epidemic, possibly plague, but now HIV is creating new selective pressure for it. In populations heavily affected by HIV, people with this variant have a survival advantage. Of course, antiretroviral drugs have dramatically changed the picture in recent years, making HIV a manageable chronic condition rather than a death sentence. This has relaxed the selective pressure. But in places where drug access is limited, selection continues. And HIV isn't the only new disease creating selective pressure. Emerging infectious diseases are a constant threat. SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika, and most recently COVID-19 have all demonstrated that pathogens continue to evolve and jump into human populations. Each represents a potential selective pressure, favoring genetic variants that confer resistance. The COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, showed marked differences in disease severity across individuals, even controlling for age and known risk factors. Some of this variation is likely genetic. Studies have already identified several genetic variants associated with severe COVID outcomes. If the pandemic had continued longer without vaccines or treatments, these variants would have been under selection. There are also selective pressures related to modern environments and lifestyles that didn't exist for our ancestors. For instance, the modern diet, high in processed foods and sugar, creates selective pressure for genetic variants that help regulate blood sugar and avoid obesity and diabetes. The thrifty gene hypothesis suggests that variants that helped our ancestors survive periods of famine by efficiently storing fat are now detrimental in environments of abundant food. Whether this is actually driving evolution is debated, but there's some evidence that alleles associated with obesity and diabetes are becoming less common in some populations. possibly due to reduced reproductive success of people with these conditions. Pollution and environmental toxins represent another modern selective pressure. Exposure to heavy metals, industrial chemicals, and other pollutants can affect health and fertility. Genetic variants that provide some protection, perhaps through more efficient detoxification pathways, would be favored. There's even evidence that some populations exposed to specific pollutants for generations have evolved resistance. For instance, some populations of killifish living in highly polluted estuaries have evolved resistance to industrial chemicals that would kill normal fish. While we don't have comparable examples in humans yet, the principle is the same. Persistent environmental challenges create selective pressure. Finally, there's sexual selection, which operates not through survival, but through differential mating success. Traits that make individuals more attractive to potential mates, either because they signal good genes or for arbitrary cultural reasons, will spread. In humans, sexual selection has likely played a major role in our evolution, though it's harder to study than natural selection. In modern populations, sexual selection continues. There's some evidence that it's becoming more important as natural selection through differential survival weakens. If almost everyone survives to reproductive age, then differences in who mates with whom become the primary driver of evolutionary change. Beauty standards, personality traits that attract partners, even things like sense of humor or musical ability might be under sexual selection. The challenge is that these traits are influenced by many genes and many environmental factors, making it hard to tease apart the genetic component. But sexual selection is likely one of the ongoing evolutionary forces shaping modern humans. So if humans are still evolving, what's actually changing? We've talked about some examples already: lactose tolerance, malaria resistance, starch digestion. But let's look more systematically at what recent human evolution has accomplished. First, there are changes related to climate adaptation. As humans spread out of Africa and into different environments over the last 100,000 years, they encountered radically different climates. From tropical jungles to Arctic tundra, from scorching deserts to cool, temperate forests, humans adapted, both culturally and biologically. Skin color is perhaps the most obvious example. Our species almost certainly evolved dark skin in Africa, where intense sunlight and UV radiation are threats. Dark skin, rich in melanin, protects against UV damage, which can cause skin cancer and destroy folate, a B vitamin essential for development. But when humans migrated into northern latitudes, dark skin became a disadvantage. At high latitudes, UV radiation is much weaker, and the body needs UV exposure to synthesize vitamin D. Dark skin blocks too much UV, putting people at risk of vitamin D deficiency, which causes rickets and other health problems. So populations in Europe and Asia evolved lighter skin, multiple times independently, through different genetic mechanisms. East Asians and Europeans have light skin, but the specific mutations responsible are largely different, showing that evolution found multiple solutions to the same problem. This happened relatively recently, probably mostly within the last 20,000 to 40,000 years. It's a clear case of rapid evolution in response to environmental pressure. And we know it was evolution, not just developmental plasticity, because the genetic changes have been identified and they're spread through populations tracked. Body shape also shows climate adaptation. though this is more subtle. Populations in cold climates tend to have stockier builds, shorter limbs, and more compact bodies. This follows Allen's rule, which states that endothermic animals from colder climates should have shorter appendages to conserve heat. Populations in hot climates tend to be more linear, with longer limbs that help dissipate heat. This variation has a genetic component. Studies of immigrants show that while environment affects body shape, much of the variation between populations persists even when people grow up in the same environment, indicating underlying genetic differences. Hair form is another climate-related trait. Tightly coiled hair, common in African populations, is thought to provide insulation for the scalp while allowing heat to radiate away from the head, useful in hot, sunny environments. Straight hair, more common in Asian populations, might have different thermal properties more suited to cooler climates. Then there are the high-altitude adaptations we mentioned earlier. These are particularly fascinating because they represent evolution occurring in near real time, evolutionarily speaking. Humans have only been living at extreme high altitudes for about 10,000 to 15,000 years, maybe 30,000 in some parts of the Andes. That's not much time, and yet clear genetic adaptations have evolved. Tibetans have mutations in EPAS1 and EGLN1 that affect how their bodies respond to low oxygen. These mutations are found in over 80% of Tibetans, but are rare in lowland populations. Andean populations have different mutations, affecting different genes, but achieving similar results. This is parallel evolution, the independent evolution of similar traits in response to similar environmental pressures. Interestingly, genomic studies suggest that the EPAS1 variant in Tibetans might have been inherited from Denisovans, an extinct hominin group that interbred with modern humans. This would be adaptive introgression, where a beneficial genetic variant from one species provides an adaptive advantage in another. Moving on to diet-related evolution, we've already talked about lactose tolerance and amylase copy number variation, but there are other examples. Populations whose ancestors were agricultural show genetic adaptations to high carbohydrate diets. Some have increased copy numbers of genes related to fat metabolism and insulin regulation. The Inuit and other Arctic populations who traditionally ate diets very high in fat and protein show genetic adaptations to this diet. They have variants in genes like CPT1A and FADs that affect fat metabolism, helping them efficiently process their traditional diet while avoiding some of the health problems that would affect people from agricultural backgrounds on the same diet. There's also been evolution in alcohol metabolism. The ability to efficiently break down alcohol varies between populations, largely due to variants in genes that code for alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes. Some variants are protective against alcoholism, but cause an unpleasant flushing reaction when alcohol is consumed. These variants are common in East Asian populations, likely selected for in response to the long history of alcohol consumption in these cultures. The unpleasant reaction to drinking reduces alcohol consumption, which in turn reduces the health and social costs of alcoholism, a form of selection acting through both health and behavior. Disease resistance has also evolved, as we've discussed, but it's worth emphasizing just how much. The immune system is one of the most rapidly evolving parts of the human genome. Pathogens are constantly evolving to evade our defenses, creating an evolutionary arms race. We see signatures of recent selection all over immune system genes. Blood groups, for instance, might have been selected due to disease resistance. The O blood type appears to confer some protection against severe malaria, which might explain why it's so common. Different blood types might also provide resistance to different pathogens, maintaining diversity through balancing selection. Then there are changes we can observe happening in real time, over just a few generations. We mentioned earlier that selection is acting on reproductive timing in modern populations, but there are other measurable changes. One surprising finding is that the median artery, a blood vessel in the forearm that typically disappears during fetal development, appears to be becoming more common. Research examining anatomical records suggests that in people born in the mid-20th century, it was present in about 10% of individuals. In people born in the late 20th century, it appears to be present in about 30%. That's a dramatic increase in just a few generations. Now, this might not be genetic. It could be an environmental effect, perhaps related to changes in maternal nutrition or health during pregnancy. But if it does have a genetic component, it represents extremely rapid change, though whether driven by selection, drift, or developmental plasticity remains unclear. Having an extra artery doesn't seem to provide any obvious advantage or disadvantage, which makes the pattern all the more intriguing. There's also evidence of changes in teeth. Wisdom teeth, our third molars, appear to be becoming less common in some populations. Many people are now born without wisdom teeth at all, or they fail to erupt. This could reflect evolutionary changes in response to smaller jaws and softer processed foods. Though again, separating genetic from environmental effects is challenging, and this pattern varies considerably across different populations. Brain size has actually been decreasing slightly over the last 10,000 years or so, based on measurements of ancient skulls. This isn't because we're getting less intelligent. There's no evidence that cognitive abilities have declined. Instead, it might reflect changes in diet and body size, since brain size often scales with overall body mass, or perhaps a shift toward more efficient brain organization. It's also possible that smaller, more densely connected brains might be just as capable as larger ones while requiring less energy to maintain. Though this remains a topic of active research, some of the most interesting recent evolution is happening at the genetic level in ways that don't produce obvious physical changes. Gene expression, the process by which genetic information is read and used to make proteins, is under constant evolutionary pressure. Changes in when, where, and how much of a gene is expressed can have profound effects without altering the protein the gene codes for. Regulatory regions, the parts of the genome that control gene expression, show abundant signatures of recent selection. These changes can alter development, metabolism, immune function, and countless other processes in subtle ways that don't change the basic architecture of the human body, but nonetheless affect how it works. For instance, changes in genes regulating brain development might affect cognitive function or personality. Changes in metabolic regulation might affect energy efficiency or food preferences. These are the kinds of evolutionary changes that are invisible to the naked eye, but potentially quite important. And remember, all of this is happening while the basic human body plan remains stable. We still have the same number of chromosomes, the same basic organ systems, the same skeletal structure. Evolution is tinkering with the details, not redesigning from scratch. Why visible changes are rare? Given all this evolutionary activity, why don't we see more dramatic visible changes? Why do we still look so much like our ancestors from tens of thousands of years ago? The answer involves several interlocking factors. First, as we've discussed, our long generation time means that evolution proceeds slowly in absolute time, even when it's happening quickly in generational time. Changes that would be visible in a skeleton, things like overall body proportions, limb length, or skull shape, require changes in developmental programs that are deeply conserved and tightly integrated with other systems. You can't just make arms longer without affecting shoulder structure, muscle attachment points, nervous system organization, and cardiovascular supply. All of these things are controlled by many genes interacting in complex ways. Changing them in a coordinated fashion takes time, many generations, because multiple mutations need to arise and spread together. Second, there's been relatively little time, evolutionarily speaking, for major changes to accumulate. Anatomically modern humans emerged around 200,000 years ago. That sounds like a long time, and it is by human standards, but it's actually a very short time evolutionarily. It's only about 8,000 generations, give or take. For comparison, the lineage leading to humans and the lineage leading to chimpanzees split about 6 million years ago. That's roughly 240,000 generations. During that time, both lineages underwent dramatic changes. Humans evolved upright posture, much larger brains, reduced body hair, and many other distinctive features. Chimps evolved their own specializations, but those changes took millions of years and hundreds of thousands of generations. The changes that have occurred within our species, within anatomically modern Homo sapiens, have had far less time to accumulate. We're still, in a sense, a young species, and many of the potential evolutionary pathways are just starting to be explored. Third, for much of the last 200,000 years, human populations were small and fragmented. Total human population probably didn't exceed a few 100,000 for most of our history, and these people were scattered across Africa and eventually beyond in small, often isolated groups. Small population size limits the amount of genetic variation available for evolution to work with. It takes longer for beneficial mutations to arise, and when they do, they're more vulnerable to being lost by chance before they can spread. Genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies, becomes more powerful in small populations, sometimes overwhelming selection. It's only in the last 10,000 years since the adoption of agriculture that human population has really exploded. We went from maybe 5 million people worldwide at the start of agriculture to over 8 billion today. That massive population growth has created a huge pool of genetic variation, thousands of times more variation than existed in our ancestors. More variation means more raw material for evolution to work with, and potentially faster evolution. Fourth, many of the selective pressures acting on modern humans are different from those that shaped our early evolution. Our ancestors faced challenges like predation, finding food, avoiding environmental hazards, and competing with other hominins. These pressures selected for things like intelligence, endurance, physical strength, and social cooperation. Modern humans face different challenges: disease resistance, adapting to new diets, coping with different climates, and in very recent times, adapting to modern environments with abundant food, sedentary lifestyles, and novel technologies. These selective pressures favor different traits, but many of them, like disease resistance genes or metabolic efficiency, don't produce obvious changes in outward appearance. Fifth, evolution is constrained by history. We can only evolve modifications of what already exists, not entirely new features out of nowhere. This is called phylogenetic constraint. Human bodies are built on a mammalian plan, which is built on a vertebrate plan, which is built on earlier animal body plans stretching back hundreds of millions of years. We can't evolve wings because our forelimbs are already committed to being arms and hands, which we need for tool use. We're stuck with them. We can't evolve gills because our developmental program is set up to build lungs, not gills, and rewiring that would require coordinated changes to dozens of genes and developmental pathways. Evolution works by modifying existing structures and pathways, not by inventing entirely new ones. This means that certain kinds of changes are much easier than others. Changing the color of something, like skin or eyes or hair, is relatively easy. It involves altering the amount or distribution of pigments, which can be done by tweaking a few genes. But changing the fundamental structure of something, like adding an extra limb or dramatically enlarging an organ, is much harder. It requires coordinating changes across many genes and developmental stages without breaking anything along the way. These kinds of changes happen, but they take much longer. Sixth, many traits are under stabilizing selection, where the average is favored and extremes are selected against. For instance, there's an optimal birth weight for human babies. Too small, and they're fragile and prone to health problems. Too large, and birth become dangerous. This creates pressure to maintain birth weight around an intermediate optimum, not to push it higher or lower. Similarly, there might be optimal ranges for many physiological traits. Too much of an immune response can cause autoimmune problems. Too little leaves you vulnerable to infection. Evolution balances these trade-offs, often keeping traits relatively stable rather than pushing them in one direction. This doesn't mean these traits can't evolve. They can, if the optimum shifts due to environmental change. But it does mean that variation is constrained, and we don't see runaway evolution in any particular direction. Finally, there's the simple fact that humans now occupy a vast range of environments and ecological niches. We live in deserts and rainforests, on mountains and in valleys, in the Arctic and in the tropics. In ancestral times, different populations facing different environments would have evolved different adaptations and might eventually have diverged into separate species. But that's not happening in humans, at least not anymore, because of gene flow. Modern transportation and migration mean that even geographically distant populations exchange genes regularly. This gene flow homogenizes the species, preventing the kind of divergence that might otherwise occur. Some researchers predict that humans are actually becoming more genetically similar over time, not more diverse, as populations that were isolated for thousands of years now interbreed. This genetic averaging might reduce visible differences between populations over the very long term, though we're talking timescales of thousands of years or more. So visible changes are rare, not because evolution has stopped, but because the kinds of changes that are happening, metabolic adaptations, disease resistance, gene expression changes, are largely invisible to the eye, and because the kinds of visible changes that might occur, major alterations to body plan, take more time than has elapsed since our species originated. The future of human evolution looking forward. What does the future hold for human evolution? This is obviously speculative. Trying to predict the future is always tricky, and predicting evolutionary futures is especially so, because evolution depends on so many unpredictable factors: random mutations, environmental changes, population dynamics, cultural shifts. But we can make some educated guesses based on current trends and known evolutionary principles, and we can identify some of the factors that will shape human evolution in the coming millennia. First, population size matters. The current human population of over 8 billion is unprecedented in our species' history. This creates a massive reservoir of genetic variation, with millions of unique mutations appearing every generation. More variation means more raw material for evolution to work with, potentially leading to faster evolutionary change. However, this assumes that selective pressures persist. In a world where almost everyone survives to adulthood and most people have roughly similar numbers of children, natural selection through differential survival is weakened. But as we've discussed, selection can still operate through differential reproduction, and there are still plenty of selective pressures: disease, metabolism, reproductive timing, even if they're different from ancestral pressures. Second, globalization and migration are likely to continue, increasing gene flow between populations. This could lead to the gradual homogenization of human genetic diversity, reducing differences between populations. Already, the categories we use to describe human variation, like race, are becoming less meaningful as people from different ancestral backgrounds increasingly intermarry and have children. This doesn't mean humans will all look the same. There will still be plenty of variation between individuals, but the clustering of traits by geographic ancestry might become less pronounced over time. Of course, this assumes continued migration and interbreeding, which is culturally dependent and could change. Third, medicine and technology will continue to alter selective pressures, though in complex ways. On one hand, medical advances reduce selection against genetic diseases, allowing people with conditions that would have been fatal in the past to survive and reproduce. This increases the frequency of disease-causing mutations in the population, a process sometimes called relaxed selection or mutation accumulation. On the other hand, medicine creates new selective pressures. For instance, as we mentioned, widespread use of C-sections might reduce selection for smaller babies and wider pelvises. Reproductive technologies like IVF allow people who would have been infertile to have children, changing selection on fertility-related genes. And medicine doesn't eliminate all disease-related selection. New infectious diseases continue to emerge, and existing ones continue to evolve. Even with vaccines and antibiotics, pathogens remain a selective pressure, especially in parts of the world with limited medical access. Fourth, sexual selection will likely become more important as natural selection through survival weakens. If almost everyone survives to reproductive age, then differences in mating success become the primary driver of evolutionary change. Traits that make individuals more attractive to potential mates either through biological signals of health and fitness or through culturally determined preferences, will be favored. This could lead to evolution of traits related to physical attractiveness, social skills, personality, or any other characteristics that influence mate choice. The challenge is that beauty standards and mate preferences are culturally variable and change over time, making it hard to predict which specific traits would be favored. Fifth, and this is more speculative, we might eventually develop the ability to directly edit our own genomes. Gene editing technologies like CRISPR are already being used experimentally to treat genetic diseases. In the future, it might become possible to edit embryos to eliminate disease-causing mutations, or even to enhance certain traits. If this becomes widespread, it would represent a completely new form of evolution, directed evolution, where humans consciously choose which genetic variants to keep and which to eliminate. This could dramatically speed up evolutionary change and allow changes that would never occur through natural selection alone. However, this raises enormous ethical questions. Who decides which traits are desirable? How do we prevent inequality, where only the wealthy can afford genetic enhancements? What if we accidentally create unforeseen problems by editing genes whose full functions we don't understand? For these reasons, germline editing that affects reproductive cells and can be passed to future generations, remains controversial and is banned or heavily restricted in most countries. It might never become widespread, or it might, but cautiously and slowly. Sixth, climate change represents a major upcoming challenge and potential selective pressure. As global temperatures rise, weather patterns shift, and sea levels change, humans will have to adapt. Much of this adaptation will be cultural and technological, building sea walls, developing drought-resistant crops, relocating populations. But there might also be biological evolution, especially if climate change leads to new disease pressures or makes certain regions uninhabitable. Populations in affected regions might face selection for heat tolerance, disease resistance, or metabolic efficiency. Seventh, space exploration, if it becomes a reality, could create entirely new evolutionary pressures. Living in low or zero gravity, exposed to cosmic radiation with limited resources, would present challenges our ancestors never faced. Populations living off Earth for many generations might evolve distinct adaptations. This could eventually lead to speciation if populations become isolated enough and diverge sufficiently. Earth humans and Mars humans might eventually become different species, unable to interbreed. But this would take thousands or millions of years and assumes long-term colonization that might never happen. In the nearer term, the most likely evolutionary changes are subtle and incremental: continued adaptation to disease, adjustments to diet and metabolism, shifts in reproductive timing and lifespan. Visible physical changes, if they occur at all, will be slow and minor. Maybe continued changes in average height or build, shifts in facial features, alterations in hair or skin. Brain evolution is a wild card. Will our brains continue to get smaller and more efficient? Will there be selection for different cognitive traits as the demands of modern life change? Some have speculated about selection for increased intelligence, though defining and measuring intelligence is fraught with difficulties, and it's not clear what genes would be involved. Others have worried about dysgenics, the idea that modern civilization, by allowing people with genetic diseases to survive and reproduce, might lead to an accumulation of harmful mutations in the population. While relaxed selection could indeed allow some increase in the frequency of disease-causing variants, the effect is likely to be very slow, and gene therapy and other technologies may eventually allow us to address these issues directly. Evolution in intelligence, if it's happening at all, would be extremely slow, given that it's influenced by thousands of genes and countless environmental factors. One thing we can say with confidence: human evolution hasn't stopped and won't stop as long as we exist as a biological species. The specific direction it takes will depend on countless factors: environment, culture, technology, random chance. But evolution is an inevitable consequence of reproduction with variation. And that's not going away. We are still evolving, still adapting, still changing. Even if the changes are subtle and slow by human timescales, we're not a finished product. We're a work in progress, shaped by our past, adapting to our present, and hurtling toward an uncertain but fascinating future. Closing, the slow dance continues. So where does this leave us? After all this talk of genes and generation times, of lactase and malaria, of evolution past and future, what can we conclude? First, the idea that human evolution has stopped is wrong. It's understandable why people think it. We look like our ancestors from tens of thousands of years ago, and modern technology seems to have insulated us from natural selection. But when we look closely, with the tools of genomics and population genetics, we see evolution everywhere, in our genes, in our diversity, in the subtle shifts happening generation by generation. Second, human evolution is different from the evolution of most other species in important ways. Our long generation times mean evolution proceeds slowly in years, even when it's rapid in generations. Our large population size and global distribution create different dynamics than small, isolated populations. And our unique capacity for culture adds a layer of complexity, with cultural evolution interacting with biological evolution in feedback loops. Third, recent human evolution has been profoundly shaped by our own inventions: agriculture, animal domestication, urbanization, technology. These cultural changes created new selective pressures for disease resistance, dietary adaptations, metabolic efficiency, and more. We have, in a sense, created our own evolutionary environment, and we continue to evolve within it. Fourth, visible changes in human anatomy are rare, not because evolution has stopped, but because they take a long time to accumulate, and because many of the evolutionary changes happening now are invisible. Changes at the molecular level, in gene frequencies and expression patterns, that don't alter the basic human form, but nonetheless affect how our bodies work. Fifth, the future of human evolution is genuinely uncertain. We face new challenges: climate change, emerging diseases, novel technologies, and new opportunities, space exploration, genetic engineering, extended lifespans. How we evolve will depend on how we respond to these challenges and opportunities, both culturally and biologically. But perhaps the most important point is this: understanding that we're still evolving changes how we think about ourselves. We're not a finished product, eternal and unchanging. We're part of the ongoing story of life on Earth, shaped by the same forces that have shaped every other species: mutation, selection, drift, and gene flow. This realization is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that we're not separate from nature, not above biology. We're animals, primates, mammals, vertebrates, subject to the same evolutionary principles as bacteria and butterflies and blue whales. But it's also empowering because it means we have agency in our own evolution, not through controlling our genes, at least not yet, but through controlling our environment and our culture. The choices we make, collectively and individually, about how we live, what we eat, whom we have children with, what technologies we develop, all of these shape the selective pressures acting on us and thus shape our evolutionary future. We're evolving, yes, but we're not passive passengers. We're active participants in our own evolutionary story, and that story is far from over. The last 200,000 years have seen anatomically modern humans spread across the globe, develop language and culture, invent agriculture and cities, create art and science and civilization. And through it all, we've been evolving, adapting to new environments, new diets, new diseases, new challenges. The next 200,000 years, if we last that long, will undoubtedly bring changes we can't imagine. New technologies, new environments, new selective pressures. And through it all, the slow dance of evolution will continue, generation by generation, mutation by mutation, reshaping our species in ways both subtle and profound. So the next time you look in a mirror and see a face that would look familiar to your ancestor from 50,000 years ago, remember, you're not identical. You carry genetic variants they didn't have. You lack some they carried. You've been shaped by 10,000 generations of evolution, responding to challenges they never faced. And the next time someone tells you that human evolution has stopped, that we've reached some kind of endpoint, you can smile and tell them the truth. Evolution never stops. As long as we reproduce, as long as we vary, as long as we face challenges and adapt to them, we evolve. The story of human evolution didn't end when we became anatomically modern. It didn't end when we invented agriculture or cities or antibiotics or computers. It's still being written right now in hospitals and bedrooms and farms and labs around the world, in every child born, in every mutation that arises, in every life lived and every choice made. We are evolution in progress, a species in motion, still changing, still adapting, still becoming something new, not dramatically, not visibly, but inexorably, inevitably, one generation at a time. The dance continues. It always has. And as long as there are humans to dance it, it always will. If you found this journey through human evolution interesting, and if it helped you see our species in a new light, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is, and whether thinking about evolution changes how you see yourself and your place in the long story of life on Earth. Because that's really what this is all about, understanding where we came from, where we are, and where we might be going. The slow, patient, relentless process of evolution has brought us from single cells to apes to humans. And it's not done with us yet. The question isn't whether we're still evolving. The question is what will become. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, a process billions of years old that continues in you, in every cell of your body, in the genetic code you'll pass to the next generation. You are a link in an unbroken chain stretching back to the origin of life and forward into an unknowable future. And that perhaps is the most humbling and wonderful truth of all.